Welcome as we continue our journey of digging deeper into our experience of prayer. So far in this experience, in the first 6 sections, we've identified a working definition of prayer, of aligning with the divine. We've looked at the universal nature of prayer. We've done a word study on prayer in the Hebrew and Christian libraries. Then we've looked at our private, faith community, and public experiences of prayer. This week we're taking another journey within the journey of a 3-week exploration of the perils of prayer. Peril is a danger. What are the dangers in our experience of prayer? I'm using the word peril to describe the 3 dangers of prayer that I've experienced in my life within the faith community. The first one that we're looking at this week is that prayer can be a cop-out, an easy way to live our faith. I was first introduced to this peril and listening to a colleague of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was the native German pastor who was probably the most prominent young theologian in the world, in the Christian community in the 1930s. He authored many books, including the book, The Cost of Discipleship. In this book, he described the difference between cheap and costly grace. He was an esteemed faculty member of a theological school in the United States. Troubled by the followership of Adolf Hitler in his homeland, Bonhoeffer chose the route of costly grace. He returned to his homeland to join and give voice to the resistance movement against fascism, against the extermination of persons of any race other than Hitler's own race. Bonhoeffer chose the route of costly grace and died as a result of that choice. Now, his friends and colleagues in the United States begged him to stay in the United States, offer his leadership from across the Atlantic, preserving his future as a leader in the global Christian community. Safe and secure, but Bonhoeffer remembered the church in his homeland. In his thoughts and prayers, Bonhoeffer decided that safe and secure was a cop-out. He returned home to serve more than just offering thoughts and prayers. Bonhoeffer's colleague, who happened to be a professor of mine, telling this story, used a quote from an unusual source to explain the decision of his dear friend. An amazing source. Poor Richard's Almanac was penned by Benjamin Franklin. One of Franklin's reflections about faith was, quote, "Serving God is doing good to man, but praying is thought an easier service and therefore more generally chosen." Now let me read that quote again. In Poor Richard's Almanac, "Serving God is doing good to others, but praying is thought an easier service and therefore more generally chosen." To remember another in thought and prayer is the easier way. Secondary in faithfulness to service, defined as doing good to others. You see, the peril of prayer is substituting prayer for serving. Serving is doing good for others. That's the first calling of faith. So instead of prayer enforcing servanthood, prayer is a cop-out when it's chosen as the easier way. Now, this perspective is certainly relevant today when we in the U.S. are hearing just recently more and more persons responding to the reality that there are mass shootings in the United States more than in any other society in our world, citizen against citizen using the weapons of war. And the immediate response is remember these persons in our thoughts and prayers. But then the voice of the wilderness is heard. Thoughts and prayers are not enough. We must do more. You see, the peril of prayer, the cop-out, is that prayer can be cheap grace, the easier way, when more could be done. When action is possible, and so often action is costly, to remember those who suffer in our thoughts and prayers is simply not enough. We must do more. The cop-out is cheap grace. To remember those who suffer in our thoughts and prayers is good and wonderful. But the story of the encounter of Jesus and Zacchaeus comes to mind. Zacchaeus was a total stranger, climbed a tree to listen to Jesus. Jesus invited him to share a bit about his life. And in the words of Poor Richards, Zacchaeus shared his life just doing good for others. And Jesus didn't ask him if he prayed. He didn't ask Zacchaeus to profess his creed or affirmation of faith. Jesus simply replied, Zacchaeus, you're one of us. You've chosen the way of costly grace by doing good to others. Come on, join the journey of faith with me. You see, simply stated, following Jesus is more than choosing prayer as the easier way. It is more than a set of beliefs. It's a way of action, serving, doing good for others. There's a great story offered as true, which happened in the frontier days of the American West. The congregation had the regular prayer meeting on Wednesday evening. On that particular evening, they said ahead of time, we're going to pray for a family that was destitute economically in the community. The family was not a part of the church. The family would easily be typed as poor trash. Now, the meeting house was full, but absent was one of the revered elders of the congregation. He was always present, and they became worried for him. They prayed for the church elder. And then towards the end of the prayer meeting, they were interrupted by the door being opened by the son of the missing leader. They were startled at the thought that an accident or illness would be shared by the son. The son simply responded to those gathered to pray, my father is fine. He wanted me to tell you that his prayer is in the wagon. Somewhat confused, they concluded the meeting in prayer as the sun departed on horseback. They left the meeting house, and the wagon was there, full of food. His prayer is in the wagon, is costly, not cheap grace. His prayer is in the wagon, is doing good, more than thoughts and prayers. You know, my career experience of 65 years has taught me that there's nothing wrong with prayer. It's wonderful to align ourselves with the divine. But there's a danger, there's a peril of prayer when prayer is a cop-out, a way of cheap grace when we can do more, when we can act, when we can do good for another and are satisfied not by just remembering another in thoughts and prayers, but when we can serve by our actions. Costly grace. Doing good often costs more than prayer. But indeed, in Bonhoeffer's words, there's a difference between cheap grace and costly grace. And when cheap grace is only responding to another with prayer, it's not enough. It's a cop-out. But when it is an introduction to doing good, it is aligning ourselves with God. There's a lot there concerning a danger of prayer. Some questions might help you on your way. What are your personal stories of the choice between costly and cheap grace? Between prayer and doing good? Secondly, what are your stories of your community of faith facing the choice between cheap and costly grace, between prayer and doing good? And finally, what's your response to changing the call to prayer? Let us pray from an invitation to verbal prayer to a call for doing good, a call to serve. Thank you for being a part of our journey.